Ati hei mauri ora ki te whai ao ki te ao marama. A kimihia te pō, rangahaua te ao, kia i o rangi, kia i o whenua, kei ngā mata o te ariki, kei mata nuku, kei mata rangi, kei reira koe e tāne te waiora. Ko ngā maungaru, ko ngā ua para whenua, here uta ki tai ki tangaroa e. Ko koe, ko au, ko tāua nei, haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tā aiki e. Tuatai ake, ko te mātāmua o te whakaaro, ki o tātou mate, ki ngā mate ki ringo i a koutou, ki ringo i a tātou katoa, kei ngā hapu, ngā marae maha putanoa i tō tātou motu, haere, haere, haere atura. Rātou ki a rātou, tātou te hunga ora, ko rawi ka mai nei i tēnei rā, ki te kōrero, ki te wānanga, ki te whakarongo, e pāna ki tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira o tātou, ara tēnā nau mai. Nau mai ngā mātā waka kei wainganu i a tātou katoa, koutou i whai wā tēnei, i tēnei wā ki te noho tahi. He mihi nui tēnei mai a tātou ki a koutou. Ko te manako, ka pai te haere o tō tātou wānanga, maha ngā hua, ngā pukenga kei wainganui ngā kaikōrero, no reira, are taringa mai. And my name is Hautapu Baker, and it is my privilege to open up our hui, our webinar today. So, he pito mata, which is the name of our webinar, is derived from the whakatauki iti noa he pito mata, a small seed that can sustain many. It refers to a small uncooked portion of kumara replanted to provide many more, and speaks to kai production and the interconnected relationship between whenua and people. Events like the Kaikōura earthquake, COVID-19, Cyclone Gabrielle exposed our food system's vulnerability to shocks, its dependence on our whenua, and how disasters can exacerbate existing inequalities among our people. By distributing food production and distribution systems, such events resulting in food shortages that can affect not only communities immediately impacted by disasters, but potentially the entire country. Directors of the 7 national science challenges have collated a national food strategy to guide food-related policy decisions and actions, including those around food system vulnerabilities and inequities. Our webinar, He Pito Mata, brings together experts on food security, food resilience, and Indigenous food sovereignty to explore how we might build a food system that can ensure our nation has enough food to feed our people both pre and post disaster. So, I hope you've got yourself a nice hot cup of tea, you've got your biscuits or your scones or anything else you might need, because our panelists today are absolute weapons in their field, and I'm sure that you won't want to miss anything that they have to say. On that note, however, this webinar is being recorded, so once it's done, everyone that has registered for this webinar will receive a recording of this kaupapa as well, and likely the slides to accompany that kōrero too. A few other housekeeping things you might see, actually, if you see the little react emoji, can you give me like a love heart if you can see the chat function? Can everyone see the chat function on the top of their screen? Bye-bye. Awesome, perfect. So in that, feel free to chuck in a question anytime throughout the course of our presenters. If you have a question for a particular presenter, please just write their name so we know that who you're directing the question to, and obviously your partai. But if it's obviously a general question, then just put your question in there, and we will try our best before the webinar ends to answer all the questions that come through. However, if we don't, fear not, we'll make sure that we'll get those responses sent out via email as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it from me. Welcome to our hui, the first webinar on this kaupapa for 2024. Excited and stoked to see the response, I think, which really speaks to the need to have this discussion and put some awesome discussions into action. So without further ado, I'm going to hand te rākau kōrero, or the speaking stick per se, over to Nick Craddock Henry, who is going to facilitate the rest of our hui. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Nick Craddock Henry. I'm the co-lead of the Resilience Policy and Governance Program in the Resilience to Nature's Challenges National Science Challenge. Thank you to Hautapu, and thank you to all of our speakers who have agreed to present this afternoon. We're known for our food production here in Aotearoa. Agricultural exports, including dairy and other commodities, are a significant driver of GDP and agri-food production is fundamental to local and regional economies. However, we've seen in the last decade this steady increase in climate-related extremes. I think there was 17 weather-related emergencies in 2003, up from a sort of a long-term average of 1 or 2. Everything from storms in Te Rāwhiti, Gisborne, Auckland anniversary floods, which affected vegetable growers in Pukekohe, and that itself followed on from drought. There's been Cyclone Gabrielle, and then looking further back, there's been the Kaikōura, Marlborough, Huarunu earthquake, and then, of course, the Christchurch earthquakes. And food system security and insecurity is shaped not only by hazard events, but also by the underlying social and economic conditions that limit access, reduce purchasing power, or in other ways compound existing inequity. So this afternoon, we're going to dive into the resilience of food systems here in Aotearoa, looking across both the research and the value chain to better understand the significance of systems, of recovery, and of disasters. And this is also an opportunity to launch a policy brief, which is available on the Resilience Challenge website, and which will make the link available following the webinar, which is the first of a series of policy briefs focusing on disaster recovery. As the National Science Challenges sort of wind down, we're looking to increase the policy relevant and practice relevant outputs from the challenges, and leave a legacy that can inform long-term planning and actions across the country. So our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Jessica Hutchings, and Jess is the co-chair of Tangata Whenua of RNC, and looks at a number of issues related to food security and insecurity for Māori, and she'll be presenting this afternoon on food for hope and well-being. And I'll pass over to Jess.
Ka pai, kia ora Nick, koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi kia koutou. Te mea tutahi he mihi atu kia koe a hautapu I noi tu whera te hui nei. He mihi atu kia koe mo tō whakaro me he pai ki o ki te rongo ki te reo I tēnei wā. He mihi atu kia koe mo te whakamārama o te kaupapa he pitumata. He mihi nui kia koe kia koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present in this webinar. I now have 14 and a half minutes to talk about a kaupapa that really for us starts in the colonisation of our lands and our waters and our whenua and our diets in Aotearoa as soon as settlers came to Aotearoa. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the fact that actually Māori have been included in this webinar. And we might think that that's a given these days, but as I have, people may have noticed, I have been quite outspoken lately about calling out the lack of participation by Māori in a lot of these conversations around food systems in Aotearoa, around food strategies in Aotearoa, and around regenerative agriculture. So thanks very much, RNC. I know I'm sitting on the governance group in the co-chair tangata whenua role, but thanks RNC for positioning kaupapa Māori right in the centre so that we're not erased by ongoing settler colonialism or on the periphery and our views are not heard. So I just want to start, I will of course talk about our Marsden funded project Kaiatua that we're just finishing off, but I just want to start just by, laying a different context for thinking about food security in Aotearoa, laying a decolonial context, a kaupapa Māori context in Aotearoa around food, and really to, remind us that this country looked very different 250 years ago. It was a whenua and it was waterways and it was awa and it was moana of which my ancestors, many of our ancestors, ate from, and as I describe in my writings, we ate from our cultural landscapes. When we eat from our cultural landscapes, we eat and we consume our reo, we eat and we consume our mātauranga. And the erosion of our landscapes and the confiscation of our lands and the degradation of our environments has eroded our ability to return as Indigenous peoples with our divine Indigenous senses to eat from our cultural landscapes. So when we look around the motu, when we drive around the motu and we see all of the sheep and beef and the dairying that's going on, and we talk about GDP and we talk about progress and we talk about New Zealand exports economy, for me as an Indigenous person in Aotearoa, as a food sovereignty activist and as a researcher, my heart weeps. And that might not be, you know, I don't need to go through 3 peer review processes to have it confirmed that actually we have not only a crisis, but we have the ripping apart of the soul and the fabric of who we are as Indigenous peoples here, when we cannot return to our food sources, to eat our landscapes and to know ourselves as our tūpuna did through the foods that they ate. So when we see dairy and when we talk about export, when we talk about food strategies, my question to all of us as a community of practice, a community of change makers to return right livelihood to our food systems in Aotearoa, my tono to all of you is, how can you help to heal our cultural landscapes, our food landscapes, to return food to a place of hope and well-being again for our people? And I think that's where resilience is for us in our food sovereignty and our foodscapes. It's about returning to be able to right relationships, but to return food to this place of hope and this place of well-being, not a place that degrades and strips of soil from our soil health or degrades soil microbiology, but a place actually where we can come and know ourselves through what we ingest, because it's part of who we are. We are nature, tangata whenua, not separate. You know, we know ourselves in relationship to the land and in relationship to our foodscapes. So mihi anō kia koutou e te whanau o RNC for placing kōrero Māori, Māori kōrero, whakaaro Māori at the centre. And my challenge to all of you joining us today is to keep us at the centre of this conversation, because we don't have time to go on a learning journey and work out how we work with Māori and Pākehā to do this, because our food system is at a crisis. And we know globally we only have 50 harvests left globally because of soil degradation. So the time is right now. We'll work it out in the doing of it. Let's not talk about where Māori should be in this conversation, because we should be leading out and we should be at the centre. Hoi anō koutou. Ka huri au ki te kaupapa o te rānei, ko te kaupapa o te mahi rangahau, ko te kai atua. So I want to talk today about a Marsden-funded project that I've been running with my wife, Associate Professor Jo Smith from Victoria University, Te Herenga Waka. And we're just finishing it off, and it's called Kai Atua, Food for Hope and Wellbeing. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about what we've found and what we've learned and where we think we need to go next. And we are, I was going to say lucky and fortunate, but I'm actually going to say well deserving to just be awarded a second Marsden to standard grant following on from this project called Seeding Hope, which continues this kaupapa around Indigenous women's sovereignty stories and activism around connecting up across seed communities. And it's not, yeah, I'll just leave it there. Kia ora. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I always begin my kōrero by really acknowledging my standpoint. As a kaupapa Māori researcher, as somebody who has come through science, my PhD is in science, you know, my standpoint is to really counter the false neutrality of Western science and the false claims of objectivity. So there's nothing objective about kaupapa Māori research. There's nothing objective about my standpoint. He wahine Māori, he wahine Takatapui. I hail from the tribe of Ngaitahu Ngāti Huirapa and from Gujarat, India. I live on the tribal lands of Te Atiawa in Kaitoki, north of Wellington. We are Huaparakori food farmers. We live on 12 acres. Our kaupapa is all about Indigenous determination. Mana wahine, mana takatapui. Our kaupapa is rematriation, and we're not taking that objective stance or that false neutrality in Western science. We actually are using research to lift up the kōrero of our people and our intergenerational instructions from our ancestors to further the, it's not even the recovery, to be able to survive as Indigenous peoples again, and not to continue the assimilation and the colonisation of who we are through foodscapes. So that's who I am, and that's the position from which I enter into this research. Next slide, please. Our project, Kaikōura Food for Hope and Wellbeing, really started off wanting to understand what is a Māori food system, what constitutes a Māori food system. And in the kind of Western research and food studies, they talk about supply chains, they talk about value chains, but for Te Ao Māori, it's very different when we think about food systems. And what you have in front of you is how we are depicting a food system through working with the kaupapa Māori visual designer, Johnson Witihira from IDIA, to understand what a Māori food system is. And it's also too really important for us to be able to communicate our mahi rangahau as kaupapa Māori researchers through other devices that are not journal articles, locked behind paywalls, that further the reproduction of knowledge in ways which actually exclude our communities in terms of who we are in service to. So our food systems are held within the atua, or the deity, the spiritual landscapes of our world. And so you will see at the top here, Ranginui, Papa Tuanuku, they are our atua, of which kind of hold the conceptual framing for us to think about our food system. We position it within a kiutuki tide, from mountains to sea, within that landscape, an interconnected landscape, and it holds diversity. So all of the tiki that you can see, all of the po that you can see on either side there, for those people though on the webinar who have a literacy in whakairo Māori and our carvings, you may be able to identify some of the features from the tiki in your wharenui. And what we're trying to do here is to say that actually the foodscapes are located in place and with communities and are different, ia rohi, ia iwi. So in different places and with different iwi, there's different foodscapes that our people and our ancestors ate that we aim to restore and return to. And then of course it's a representation of both contemporary and historical food. So we need to be really careful not to pigeonhole and historicise Indigenous knowledge as something in the past, but actually it's always been an evolving knowledge form. It's always been a living knowledge form. It's intergenerational. It's based on close observation with nature over a long period of time, and those observations are passed down through time. So what we're really doing in this project of Kaikōura is trying to understand how different Māori communities are enacting food systems and food security and food sovereignty at place in different ways that of course is informed by their cultural landscapes. So in our project, our methodology, kaupapa Māori methodology, we worked with 15 Māori communities, diverse Māori food communities who are doing food at marae, at a whānau level, at a community level, in urban spaces and in rural spaces. And we wanted to understand for them what Kaikōura meant and what food sovereignty meant for them. So there's a lot of stuff written in the literature about it, but in terms of our rangahau Māori and Aotearoa, we're very, this is a very emerging field. Next slide, please. Just checking my time as well. So this is what we found. We found that for kai sovereignty in Aotearoa, that it is connected to wairua. And I'm not just going to skip over this, connected to wairua, and move on to the next one, because for me this is at the heart of what Kaikōura is. Kaikōura, food from our atua landscapes, the divine landscapes of our gods, to return to us as godly beings. This is how our kaumātua talk about it in the Māori Organics group. So our foodscapes and everybody that we interviewed were all growing food in a way that connected them both to place, but connected them to a practice that lifted up their wairua and re-put wairuatanga back into the fabric of food and to food growing. And this is absolutely critical when we think about food security and food sovereignty in Aotearoa. And I ask you just to reflect on where wairuatanga is held within the commodity products that New Zealand produces for export for the international market. So, you know, from my standpoint, devoid of wairua, devoid of community, is there for to serve the needs of what I would describe as capitalist patriarchy, and not there to serve the needs of community. The other thing that we learnt is that, of course, it's an intergenerational practice, kai sovereignty, and this intergenerational practice has been severed everywhere. So, you know, we can go looking for it and it exists in places, but our job now in the recovery from colonisation is to rebuild it. The other key aspect of it is that it has to have an everyday we have to have an everyday connection with our foodscape, whether or not that be marakai or that be in the ngahere hunting or in the awa catching tuna or in the moana. But our tūpuna had an everyday connection with their foodscapes. And so how can we return as Indigenous peoples to have that everyday connection? That's not mediated by technologies. That's not mediated by sitting behind a computer and, you know, looking what's going on, but actually smelling and feeling hiniahoni, the soil, smelling and feeling tawhiri mātea, the wind. How can we connect those atua landscapes back into our foodscapes? And then, of course, the last aspect there is about influencing policy and political settings. So when we talk to Māori people about kai sovereignty, Māori communities in this project, this is what they talked about. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one example of kai atua is the hua parakuri, and I've written about this quite a lot, been involved with the Māori Organics group. But as an example, the hua parakuri, the Māori Organics framework, is a framework which guides us through kaupapa Māori, through these 6 beautiful principles that you can see on your screen, to be able to produce a hua parakuri product, which we define in the Māori organic space as kai atua. And our kaumātua Percy Tipini, who's now passed away, would describe it as food from the realms of the atua, of the gods, fit for the gods. So that's how he describes kai atua. So again, it's a rhetorical question. How is the global commodity market, how are we producing kai atua food in New Zealand? Where, are we sending kai atua into the global commodity market? We know we're not, but we also do know that our people, our Indigenous peoples in Aotearoa, people of colour predominantly in Aotearoa, are eating food from the commodity market, which is devoid of kai atua. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I often describe our food systems in Aotearoa as requiring us to eat colonisation and whiteness in our everyday. Whiteness on our plate. We think of colonisation all around the world bringing it's refined whiteness, isn't it? Which is, refined whiteness in terms of refined sugars, refined flours. What happens when we're eating and ingesting colonisation every day through our foodstuffs, 3 meals a day? And it's not just the food, it's actually the packaging and the food waste, and we know that waste is a product of colonisation as well. So I think, I'm excited for kaupapa Māori research in this field in the next couple of decades, and the peeling back of the layers that we need to do to be able to decolonise our foodscapes. Our foodscapes in Aotearoa. I'm just going to finish on the next slide. Actually, could we go to slide 12, please? Sorry, understanding kai atua. I'm just over time, and in respect of my colleagues, not going to take too much more. But I just will finish off on this slide and just share with you, some of the understandings that we have developed through this project around kai atua, which we are still unfolding. It's from the standpoint of tangata whenua. It's about the interconnectedness of lands, waters, and human and more than human relationships. It's connected to place, to tūranga waiwai. It's a pathway to healing. And so we really need to think of food as something to heal us, not something, we ingest it and we all need to eat, but actually food is rongoa. He kai te rongoa, he rongoa te kai. Let food be thy medicine, medicine be thy food. It assumes soil and human health are deeply interrelated. I've done a lot of work in the soil sovereignty space and the need to elevate the mana of hiniahone. And I just put the tono out there to all of you that, how can we return personhood status to hiniahone in New Zealand? Could we be the country in the world that actually makes the argument to return personhood status to our soils on a national level? How are we protecting our soils? And then just carrying on through some of these bullet points, kai atua is about diversity. We're not homogenised as Indigenous peoples, as we we didn't discover anything, as we know as Indigenous peoples and Māori, that we're diverse across hapu and whānau and iwi, of course, because our landscapes and our cultural landscapes are diverse. And then, of course, it's intergenerational. It's about mokopuna decision making. So, hoi anō koutou, it's just a very quick intro into a project that we've been working on very deeply for 3 years. I'm very pleased that we have the opportunity to continue this work, because when you're building a field, as many Māori and Indigenous people on the webinar will know, sometimes we have to just lay the foundations before we actually get to kind of doing the actual work that we really need to do, that's going to be the transformational work. And I hope in the science system, and whatever happens with the investment post the NSCs, that there's funding in this space. He mihi nui kia koutou, he mihi nui ki te kaupapa, kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui.
Kia ora, Jess. Thanks so much for that really powerful introduction, and for really setting the scene for the other talks. I thought particularly the sort of the need to return right livelihoods to food systems, and also that food can be a pathway to healing, particularly as we think in the context of disaster risk recovery, and how that perspective and that view and interpretation and those ways of knowing about food systems can be a pathway for that. So we'll move on to our second speaker, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end for questions for Jess and the others. And so I'd like to introduce Trish Malcolm from the Zero Hunger Collective. And sort of in keeping with some of the themes from Jess's talk, one of the things that struck me when sort of reading Trish's introduction was that food insecurity is not about a lack of abundance. That we have a lot of resources, but it's the ways in which those resources are shared, who has access to them, how that access is shaped and distributed, which can influence and shapes those responses and the way we need to manage that. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Trish.
Kia ora koutou katoa, kia tau kia koutou nā mihi te atapai me te rangimaria o ngā atua. Kia tuatahi, kia mihi ki ngā atua, inana nei tātou ia whai oranga ai. Nā mihi koutou tō Māori me tō mana, nā mihi ki te o tātou tūpuna kia tuku mai ngā mātauranga hei tiaki i ngā tangata katoa. Nā mihi kia tātou katoa I hiuhiu mai ki konei, nā mihi ki tō kanohi kitia, no mai, mihi mai. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's wonderful to be with you. It's a real privilege to be in this room. I got a bit thrown by the fact my slides disappeared and then my screen disappeared, so I couldn't see anything. So I do apologise for that. I really want to acknowledge what has brought us here. That is our tupuna, it is our atua, and it is each other. Acknowledge the National Sciences Challenge, the Resilience to Nature's Challenges, for hosting us today, and for this opportunity to be kind of curious, creative, and to listen well to each other. Thank you, Hautaki Baker, for the karakia to open us and clean this space up for us so that we can be here to open our minds and our hearts and our whole beings in a listening way so that we might hear each other's wisdom. Acknowledge my fellow speakers and acknowledge that we've been called experts in this space. I don't feel like the expert. I think I'm the only non-academic out of the four of us, but also to acknowledge that all of you who are in the room listening are also experts, and one of the most refined tools that we need at this time in our history is actually the art of listening. So if nothing else, take away from me today that the art of listening is at the key of everything. So who am I? Ko Waikiri. No ingarangi ko te rama me te amini te iwi o ku tupuna, nā te tiriti o Waitangi kei te tēnei whenua ahau, I raro au ki te maru o ngā maunga kaukau otari me ahu mairangi, ka rerea kai wharawhara o oku waiwai, e noho ana au me taku whānuiti I pōneke and inānei. Te Pauarahi o Kurihi Kai Zero Hunger Collective Te Mahi o Toku Manua, ko Trish Malcolm tōku ingoa. So I'm Trish Malcolm. I'm physically in the kind of Te Whanganui a Tara Pōneke area, but I'm the Pauarahi of Kurihi Kai Zero Hunger Collective, and with my wonderful team, I work across a diverse range of sectors trying to connect and work collaboratively so that all in Aotearoa alongside our taio might thrive. Kurihi Kai is made up of organisations and people who are committed to addressing the root cause of food-related poverty, as well as working collaboratively and collectively to create a food secure Aotearoa. This means we attempt to bring together a diverse group of people, and whenever you bring people who are different from each other together, there's always challenges in that space. And so again, that posture of listening is a huge part of who we try to be as a collective, and building on the relationships that really make the long-term difference. And our long and our dream is that we could build a long-term mana-centred food secure Aotearoa to enable all people at all times to have agency and access to enough nourishing, affordable, good food. Sadly, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, around 15 to 20% of our population actually struggle to gain enough good food. They experience food security in an ongoing way. That number has increased with every shock over the last 184 years, whether they be economic shocks, environmental shocks, political shocks, and pandemics that we've experienced more than once in our history. Those are not unique to the last 5 years, and the biggest contributing factor to them all is actually colonisation. Often when people are trying to explore the roots of food insecurity, we go down little rabbit holes and can look at one particular thing. But if you continue down the rabbit hole, you will find that colonisation is at the bottom of that rabbit hole. We know that food insecurity is driven by systems, but is experienced by papatūānuku and our people. It is our value systems that allow people to experience and papatūānuku to experience the harm that comes from food insecurity. For us at Kurihi Kai, that means it's about working in the community space, the economic spaces, it's about knowledge, environment, health, industry, etimea. All of these things are essential so that through our relationships we can all thrive. We often are told that there is a scarcity of things, particularly food, although sometimes housing. But when we work together, we know that there is an abundance of things. And we'll talk about resilience, and it's often about talking about flipping our mindsets. So in flipping our mindsets, the thing that we're told we need to reconstruct. So when we flip from scarcity, we flip to abundance. Financial gain flips to well-being for all. Individual wealth, which is often what we're encouraged, particularly within our schooling system, to think about being our goals in life. When we flip that, it becomes prosperity through connectedness and community. If we flip extraction, which is often the behaviour of our food system, we can flip to deep listening, which is not just listening to each other as humans, but listening to our environment and listening to what is going on so that we can be in tune and learn and know what is good in this moment in time. I know that someone said to me that in mapping the maramataka, there were warnings about Cyclone Gabrielle, and it's not that we didn't do the right things there, but it's that as an entire population, as an entire country, as a government, and we are the government, we weren't deeply listening, we were carrying on with our extraction behaviour. And that same thing of we turn from hoarding to sharing knowledge and curiosity. So all of this sounds really good, but one of the important things is that we might need some tools to getting there. These are just 10 tips that I have that when I'm working with people who are near the beginning of their journey around food security and food resilience. And there are a couple of key ones in there. You can take your time to digest them in your own rhythm. But probably the most important one, particularly for tangata tiriti, is that when we move into this space, we have to be willing to give away our power. We have to be willing to give away our power and therefore our control. I read somewhere very recently that humility is apparently the sexiest behaviour when it comes to leadership. So if you want sexy leadership, try a bit of humility. Another wise person once said to me, unfurl your hand and all will come. And I think particularly for tangata tiriti, that's a really important behaviour, is to actually release the grip that we have on everything. Stop being afraid, but let go a little. And that leads us to point 2. Te tiriti o waitangi is our superpower. It shows us how to behave and invites us into deep relationship. Tangata tiriti, remember, do not be afraid. If you are, think about step 1. And then the third step, know what we're talking about. If it's food security or food resilience and food sovereignty, don't let other things creep in pretending that they are these. If it's food security that we're focusing on, know that it's food security, not food insecurity that we're focusing on. I'm going to flip to the next slide because I just really want us to lead ourselves into that space. Imagine for a moment what food security in Aotearoa might look like. What images come to mind or come to your heart? What does it smell like? What does it feel like under your feet or in your hands or under your bottom? What does it feel like against your skin? What does it sound like? What can you hear? What does it taste like? And who is with you as you imagine what a food secure Aotearoa for all might be? This is a question that we've asked many people across Aotearoa in many different settings, and they've come up with some really beautiful answers to this. Ironically, none of them describe a person sitting alone in a large house, scrolling on Instagram with nobody following their Instagram. Food security is described by people of all walks of life as something like a big celebration where there are all sorts of different kind of people and kai is right at the middle of it all. Food security is people cooking kai and bringing kai that they have grown and harvested, sharing that kai, laughing and singing and drawing others into conversation, people known and people not yet known. Food security looks like deep listening, listening to stories and lives, knowledge and dreams, listening where there is joy and sorrow and realness, listening and people feeling heard. Food security is tamariki everywhere, running and playing and helping their nannies. It is where no one is hungry, where people can find food that makes their hearts sing and connects them to one another. I loved that Jessica talked about wairua, and that kind of made me think of that line. Food security starts with papatūānuku. It helps everything to be sustained, cared for, connected and thriving. When food security exists, there are no leftovers. There is never too much because there is never any waste. Some might be given away to take home, some might be used to replenish the soil, some might be used to be made into beautiful things to be shared on another day when the bounty is at low ebb and people are in need. I hope that what your wonderings have been might sit somewhere alongside some of those things, but I'm sure that you have some other creative things as well that will add to that and bring richness. This is what I was talking about when I said, when we stick to what we know, if we're talking about food security, then let's talk about food security or food resilience and food sovereignty. They're kind of all connected to each other, but we need to be a little careful. Food security under the UN definition, and this is the short one. If you want to go read the big one, it's over 100 pages long, but it's full of really rich and beautiful things for us to learn from. The UN definition of food security is when all people at all times have agency and access, that's physical, social and economic, to sufficient, safe, sustainably sourced, nutritious food that meets their food preferences, which includes our cultural preferences, and dietary needs to have an active and healthy life. We can get lost in some of those words, but at the heart of them, for me, there is agency and access. And when we move into a space where we need to look at resilience, agency and access, I think, become really helpful guides. Agency means choice. Agency means self-determination. Not only in the choosing of food, perhaps from a supermarket shelf, but over every aspect of its supply. It is the ability to choose not to go to the supermarket. It is ability to choose how your food has been grown, sourced or transported, the knowledge that is wrapped around it. Agency is so important and in Aotearoa contributes to the concept of sovereignty. Access means economic, physical and cultural. That means being able to move through our communities in order to get the food that we need. Food security is often confused with food insecurity, but food security doesn't mean access to a food parcel or even a social supermarket. Those things are often helpful when we're experiencing food insecurity in the short term, but unexpected short-term food insecurity is tolerable, but it is not when it becomes long-term. They do not create sustained food security. When we look for resilience, aid is needed for a few days or maybe even a few weeks, but it is not a long-term plan for food security. I've often heard Pākehā, particularly charity organisations who work in the food space, talk about creating sovereignty within their spaces, but I think I really want to challenge that concept and just really ask ourselves to reflect on that when we use words like sovereignty as Pākehā, we need to be very careful. Sovereignty in Aotearoa belongs with Māori, and until Māori have complete sovereignty, we can't claim any level of sovereignty as Pākehā in this space. And when we exist in a charity space, sovereignty has already been taken away from those who come and ask for assistance. We need to be really thoughtful about the words we choose as we move in this space. So how do we move towards food security? How do we maybe even move towards Māori food sovereignty? And I would just go, I'll just give all my time back to Jess so that she could continue speaking, because so much wisdom in that space, and she's so right that we need to start from a Māori perspective. We need to start with the wisdom that lies within the land and within the people who know that land the best. So if you looked at my top tips, I'd say go back to tip 2. Go back to tip 2 and just really rest in that one. Yeah, Te Tiriti o Waitangi is our superpower. Tip 5 is have a plan, know what food security is and have a plan. Don't have a plan that we need to build once we're in a place where life is difficult. We need to start building that plan and building that plan now. And in order to build that plan, we need to start with hapu and iwi and a Māori perspective in order to lay the foundations. As Jess talked about, arohi, in different locations, we need different approaches. But if we want to look at how we make ourselves food secure as a nation, we need all of those things joined up as well. And probably the last tip would be invest in relationships. Relationships are the key. Look to who is not at your table. Look to how you can include people in the table. And again, that posture of listening. We've listened over the last few weeks to the memories that have been told about the Auckland Anniversary Day floods, Cyclone Gabrielle. And the reality is that we are not all here yet. Not all have food security. I even have friends in the Ōtautahi Christchurch space who are still living with the aftermath of earthquakes, which is more than 10 years ago. And even on Auckland Anniversary Day, there was a news item around the floods that were in Southland 30 years ago. In all these places, not everyone is here yet. Not everyone is okay yet. In the resilience space, I've heard words like planned retreat, particularly from weather-affected areas, but also from the pandemic. But it's not really planned, it's not even really staged, it's more like sudden withdrawal. And in the process, some get left behind. When we are not all okay, we are not okay. So resilience is about planning, but it's about knowing who we are, knowing that we rest in te tiriti o Waitangi, knowing what we dream for in a food secure Aotearoa. And when we put all those things together, when we share ourselves with each other, when we collaborate, but do what we do best in order to hold each other up, we have a chance of getting there. That beautiful whakatauki that's framed up this webinar. He iti noa, he pito mata. From a small piece of uncooked kumara, a whole community can be fed. From our small and humble resources, when we listen, when we work together, we have enough. And just remember that kumara do not grow as single things. They grow in multiples. They grow in multiples above ground and below ground. We too can grow together to have the answers, to honour papatūānuku and to have abundance. So let's create a food secure Aotearoa where all can have enough and all are enough. Ngā mihi kia koutou. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks so much, Trish. And that follows on really nicely from Jess's presentation. I was struck by your comment right at the beginning about food systems, food insecurity, and food security is driven by systems, but that's enabled and empowered by people and the choices that we make and where we prioritize and the trade-offs we're willing to live with and accept and those that we're not. So in keeping with the sort of systems perspective and the sort of soft infrastructure, I'd like now to introduce Associate Professor Joe Fountain from Lincoln University, who will speak to us about how food systems do or do not respond to a range of shocks and stresses. Joe.
Thanks, Nick. Hopefully you can see my slide and everything's going according to plan. Wonderful. Yeah, apologies too if I cough a bit. I am just out of COVID isolation, so I'm still feeling a bit slightly fragile. Tēnā koutou katoa no ingarangi me wera ke iwi o oku tipuna no reira nā te tiriti o Waitangi ao e tēnei whenua. E noho ana ao me tako tamahine ki Waikirikiri ko Joe Fountain toku whenua. So thank you very much for hosting me today. I feel very privileged to be speaking after two such amazing women. I feel honoured and also perhaps unqualified to be here. But I am planning to speak just briefly on a project I was involved in as part of Resilience to Nature's Challenge, which I've called Recreating Food Resilient Communities for Disaster Readiness, Response and Recovery. My interest in food, this is not the right slide, there we go. My interest in food resilience did very much come about through my research in Kaikōura. I remember my first meeting in Kaikōura in about 2018 and maybe February, March 2018 with people who'd been centrally involved in the earthquake recovery process. And I asked them, what would have made your recovery process easier? And they said without a pause, if we'd known where our food was coming from, if we knew who had the deep freezers, if we knew who had the generators, if we knew who had the bullets to go in the guns to shoot the bunny rabbits. So yeah, so my interest in food resilience very much came through my work in looking at disaster resilience, disaster recovery and resilience. And I think, you know, we're all familiar, increasingly familiar with scenes such as those in the slides. And what we often see is the dramatic impact to natural environments, but also really present in the images we see of disaster response and recovery is images of people, and we see images of people helping people. And I quite like this little cartoon from Slade that talks about just that role of community, and that despite the fact that in many situations there are great divisions in our community, at times of disaster, we often do see people pulling together. And again, food is so central to disaster response. And Trish did talk about, the food insecurity and the requirement for food parcels for potentially, short periods of time. But again, when we see community responses to disasters, food is often at the core of those responses, and communities coming together to help one another. So my presentation is slightly different from the previous two, because I am talking more about community resilience and the role of food in community resilience. I don't want to get too academic here, but I just wanted to present a couple of key concepts. And the first one is that idea of community resilience. I think the term resilience has, in many circles, it's seen as quite a negative term. There are situations where people say, oh yeah, you're telling us to be resilient. So people after the earthquake in Christchurch were told they were resilient, but is resilient just about having to wait a long time for your claims to be settled? A lot of farmers have said we're sick of being told how resilient we are. We want help, we want support. But in this situation, I'm using community resilience to think about that collective ability of a neighbourhood or geographically defined area to deal with stresses and effectively resume the rhythms of daily life through cooperation after shocks. So that might be bouncing back or bouncing forward from shocks, or responding to sort of slow onset change. From this perspective, community resilience can be seen as both an outcome and a process. So it is sort of the end result of working together, but it's also through working together, community resilience can be built as well. And I think often after disasters, we hear a lot about the work that's being done to rebuild the hard infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the stop banks, and those things are all really, really important. But so too is the need to build that on that soft infrastructure. And both Jessica and Trish have, talked eloquently about that need to actually work from the soil up and rebuild that food sovereignty and the resilience around food. There are some other elements that are kind of central to understanding a resilient community: knowledge and education, resident involvement in decision making. These are all terms that are often thrown out there when we talk about what can we do to make a community more resilient. Social capital is often mentioned as well. But one thing that hasn't really been focused on in a lot of this research, and again, Jessica and Trish have made this abundantly clear, is the fact that when we talk about community resilience, often the concept is discussed without considering dynamics of power and inequality, and the way in which the term has been politicised, as I mentioned. Community resilience often overlooks the inequitable distribution of resources and support. It overlooks those existing barriers of access, language, and again, as Jessica's made clear, those historical and colonial injustices. And at times of disaster or when community resilience is most needed, there's plenty of examples where existing networks and social capital actually work to consolidate privileged positions and re-established privileged positions. As a bit of a aside, I remember after the Christchurch earthquakes, when people were homeless For people in the more affluent suburbs, you know, they had the tents, they had the chemical toilets, they could set up a camp, they had backyards, they could set up a camp in their backyards and actually cope relatively well in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, which is not necessarily the case for people in other parts of the city. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about a project that emerged out of those insights I received from Kaikōura. This was work I also did with Nick Craddock-Henry, who is facilitating this conversation. But we were interested in looking at a range of different community-based food initiatives in Waitaha, Canterbury. This included whakatauki, but also food forests and community gardens. And when we started this project, we didn't necessarily have disasters in mind. Rather, we were thinking, what's actually going on out there that around sort of community-based food initiatives that could be helpful in terms of preparing for future natural hazard events or to build a community resilience. Now, what we found in doing that study is that the initiatives we focused on, and we did end up focusing mostly on community gardens and food forests, is the timing of the establishment of these really did align with particularly the Christchurch earthquakes. So you can see there on this timeline, there were earlier gardens established, but so many of these community gardens, food forests, had actually been established after the Christchurch earthquakes. And so what our study did was talk to some of the organisers of these gardens to find out a little bit about their motivation for being established, but also what they saw the role of their gardens as being and how those roles had potentially changed over time. So what I want to present is just a few findings around that, and then I guess conclude by discussing some of the ways forward from the sort of very small scale study that we did here. So as I've already mentioned, one of the main observations we made was the importance of the impetus of the earthquakes and the post-earthquake context of Christchurch to actually see these ventures established. So the place, those of you from Aotearoa will know, the place was in a state of transition, and people talked about the fact that during that state of transition they were able to be a bit sneaky, maybe bend rules, overstep guidelines as to what they could do. So this first quote suggests that, we got permission to plant 30 trees, but we planted 65. Who was going to follow up and check with that? It was really too very clear in the interviews we did that the setting up of community gardens was as much about community as connections as it was about food. So a key motivation was around access to food security issues. But the second part of that quote is so important. It was about the need for people to connect with each other. And I love that bit of the idea, the sort of grounding, the literary grounding space for people. I have a vegetable garden. I'm blessed to have the space to have a vegetable garden, and I know that there's a lot of research that's been done about how important it is to get your hands in the soil, that it's actually good for health, it's good for well-being to just connect in that way with the soil, and that was coming through in these quotations as well. Another thing that was quite interesting is in some cases the people we talked to suggested that it had always been about the people, not the food, but in other situations people realised over time that the food was less important than they thought it had been. So there was this lovely little story here of someone who talked about the fact that your entire garlic crop has been harvested because someone thought they were leeks or vice versa. And, you know, you could get really upset about that. But actually, as the quotation says, so all of these disasters, we tend to laugh and go, you know, that's okay, because they were really happy picking all that garlic. That's absolutely fine. So, you know, I think they thought, you know, if we worry too much about it being about the food, then we could lose that kind of the flexibility, the informality that enabled people who maybe don't know a lot about gardening to feel comfortable in that space and keep coming back. Another important motivation for setting up these gardens was around the learning opportunities that were provided. So a bit of education, and I like that second quote there, that, you know, people can try to grow their own food, and with a little bit of education, they'll be more successful. And success is actually a great motivator to keep going. That actually, you know, testing the waters and getting to know a space and then getting to learn as you go, because again, you know, we are not all blessed with the same access to knowledge. I come from a family who always had a big vegetable garden, so I have that knowledge from a young age as to how to grow vegetables. And yeah, a lot of people aren't in that situation at all. It was also really apparent that different communities had very different needs. That community gardens that were in rural areas, perhaps, and in more wealthy suburbs, the feeling was quite different as to why the garden was there. So this first quote talks about the fact that, you know, many people have large backyards, so they can grow gardens if they want to. And the second quote talks about mum and dad busy with a very kind of middle class lifestyle, you know, kids off at sport, mum and dad working, and they don't have a lot of spare time. But then we also got quotations like this, you know, that it is the people who are coming are people who are struggling to put food on the table, people who are isolated in the community or might be new migrants to the community and are looking to get to know people and get to make connections. This difference between location and socioeconomic status of that location also played out in the way in which the gardens worked as well. So there were definitely in the higher decile areas gardens which were very much kind of run on a contract type basis. You know, Graham has a plot and Keith has a plot, and, you know, these individual plots, everyone works for themselves, or, you know, you don't get any vegetables unless you've helped in the garden. You know, you may need to make an effort. But again, you know, other people said, no, this is actually about a new way of thinking about food and access to food and food security. So the first quotation, they pointed out this traditional role of, you know, do some work, then you get the food, and going, well, we're not like that. The garden's open. So again, no ownership over the produce. Again, tying that idea of food being about these gardens being more about the community than the food itself, and it's about the trust and faith in that community. There was some evidence, these interviews were done, I think, in 2021, 22, so there was some evidence that the pandemic had actually changed the priorities of these gardens and the organisers of these gardens. In particular, there was this recognition of more focus on issues of food sovereignty and food security. So, you know, this idea of having community well-being through the vehicle of food, and, you know, this need to create new foods. Also, a change in the types of people coming along, so more younger people coming along to learn, they noticed post-pandemic. So in terms of moving forward, just the last couple of slides there, Nick, in terms of facilitating a more food resilient future, one of the ideas is one of the important priorities is access to land. And I love that first quote there. I look at a lot of parks, they're called reserves, but why are they reserves? What are they reserved for? Why don't we actually reserve them for growing food? And again, empowering the community to come together and decide how they want to create their public spaces and how they want to use their public spaces. Other ways of facilitating more food resilient communities, festivals and events, harvest festivals, as I mentioned before, Pātaka Kai, but also community courses in gardening, pruning, composting, cooking, preserving, all things that can happen in that public space. So in conclusion, the term resilience is, again, one of those terms that's frequently heard during disaster response, but it is also really important to build that soft infrastructure into communities. What we saw with the cyclones in particular was that the unit of response to disasters is the community. And so actually working at that community level, at the marae level, is really important. And that one size doesn't fit all, that communities are very different and have different needs and access to resources, and we should take into account that. So that's me. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to some questions later.
Kia ora, thanks, Joe. That's tremendous, and really sort of continuing to sort of enlarge the scope of the discussion as well. I've really appreciated the sort of the very much sort of the historical perspective and grounding that in Jess's initial talk, and then how we've kind of continued to weave that through as we look ahead to not only recent events but also the potential for more down the track. It's also a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Graydon Diprose. Graydon is with Manaki Whenua Land Care Research. He's a senior researcher there, and Graydon will be sort of carrying on with this theme and discussing some of his recent work looking around food insecurity in Aotearoa. Graydon.
Thanks, Nick. Kia ora koutou. So over the last 7 years, colleagues and I have been researching food rescue in New Zealand. So today I'll talk about two aspects of that, the social return on investment for food rescue and the role food rescue has played in recent disasters. So this week has been a collaborative effort. So just want to shout out to my colleagues, Louise Lee, Grace Clare from the University of Otago, and Associate Professor Kelly Dombrowski at Massey University. So I figure most of you probably already know what food rescue is, but if not, it basically just involves the collecting, storing, and redistributing edible food that would otherwise be wasted. So it might end up in the landfill as animal feed or be composted. So edible food gets wasted for a whole bunch of reasons in New Zealand. It might be incorrect labelling, international export rule changes, over-ordering or buying, climate extremes, and other supply chain disruptions. In New Zealand, food rescue organisations tend to operate in three broad ways. So some are community hubs, so these might collect rescue food and then redistribute it to other organisations who then give it to the people they work with. Some groups operate like a free store, so they just give out their rescued food directly to people, and others operate kind of like a mixed model. So they might be a bit of a community hub, so distribute food to other organisations, but they also might be connected to other initiatives, environment hubs, community kitchens, that kind of thing. So in New Zealand, most food rescue groups are funded through a mix of council and philanthropic grants, donations, and volunteer labour. So while food rescue is often framed as a really positive thing, there are debates about it. So some critics argue it can be used to justify welfare retreat and austerity measures, that it only addresses symptoms rather than underlying causes of both food waste and food insecurity. So connecting back to some of the points earlier speakers have made, and that it's kind of a misdirected form of charity that distracts from wider food system change. On the other hand, advocates suggest that we need both revolutionary change and food redistribution now. That food rescue is a useful practice kind of in the meantime while we're working towards those bigger shifts, and that food rescue may also prompt changes in wider food systems and people's perceptions of those systems. So that's, while colleagues and I are sympathetic to these kind of critiques of food rescue, we've focused more on the impacts and possibilities of food rescue, particularly exploring how communities form around food rescue and express care for other people and planet in the process. So just to give you a sense of what's been happening in the kind of government investment in food rescue space, in 2020, Ministry of Social Development invested 32 million to address food insecurity, and some of this funding went towards these three organisations here. So the New Zealand Food Network, which have a bunch of warehouses across the country that collect, store and distribute large volumes of surplus foods to local food hubs. So this has become a key in nationally coordinating surplus food across the country. Kura Hiakai Zero Hunger Collective, which Trish talked about earlier, and finally the Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance, or AFRA, which provides support for local food rescue groups through capability building or capacity building, encouraging good practice and enhancing collaboration and advocacy. So over 2021 and 2022, Grace, Louise and I worked with the Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance to undertake a social return on investment for food rescue. So we worked with 3 representative food rescue organisations in New Zealand, Just Zilch, Satisfy Food Rescue and Good Neighbour, to develop a return on investment calculation. So we drew on both quantitative and qualitative data from staff, volunteers, food donors and food recipients, and this was assured by Social Value International. So we found that for every $1 invested in food rescue, there was $4.5 generated of return or value. In addition to that number, the monetary number, we also identified 4 broad impact themes. So the first one was that food rescue creates both hard infrastructure, so chillers, food storage facilities and vehicles, and soft infrastructure, so relationships and connected communities. And the investment in redistributive infrastructure in place, so in communities, then often tends to attract other investments, so donations, volunteer labour. So in other words, redistributing surplus tends to attract more surplus. And so this is important because it's a really different way of thinking about kind of most business models that operate on an ethos of scarcity, right? The second theme was that the rescued food was being used by community partners and social service providers to build relationships with people and actually attract them to their services. Every single food recipient organisation we interviewed said they couldn't keep operating as they currently do without food rescue. Their funding doesn't extend to providing food, yet it was vital for most of their services. So in other words, food rescue has become key to their operating models, and they wouldn't be able to achieve their outcomes without food rescue. The third theme was that many food rescue organisations are demonstrating reflective practice. So they're carefully considering the experience of what it is like to receive suitable food, and they strive to ensure the mana of recipients in the process. So they've often kind of led the way in terms of thinking about the dietary needs and preferences of food recipients. And because of their operating models, they're often able to provide more fresh fruit, vegetables and protein than just the kind of standard cans and white bread, which often ends up in food banks in particular. The fourth point was the way food rescue connects 2 matters of concern, so unnecessary environmental waste and food security. So most food rescue folks we spoke to definitely saw it as a temporary band-aid, but in their view it was still an important one. So interview participants talked about how food rescue enables them to take everyday actions about things they care about, and through this modelling to others in their community that food insecurity and waste are not acceptable or inevitable. So there's kind of an important social change element to the way food rescue is working. Jumping now to more recent research. Last year, Louise and I did interviews with food rescue groups in Northland, Auckland, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay about their experiences during the Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle. So we found that they were playing a key role in filling the gaps both during the events and in the recovery phase. So for example, during the events, food rescue groups provided food for emergency accommodation at marae and welfare centres. And during the recovery phase, they provided increased support for people in addition to their kind of BAU work. And so this was particularly important for people who lost, say, all of their food when the freezers stopped working or their pantries got flooded and they couldn't afford to replace it. They were also involved in preparing emergency kits to support some of that other work. The other key finding was that the New Zealand Food Network played a really important role in coordinating deliveries and distribution directly after events and during recovery. So given their national kind of distributed infrastructure, they were really well placed to store and then schedule deliveries to keep local food groups supplied. So our overall takeaway was basically food rescue is already playing a role in emergency response in New Zealand, and we're just kind of thinking through at the moment how this could actually be more strategic and enhanced. So the future of food rescue, we're entering an era of greater disruption for both food production and distribution. So even if we miraculously achieved food security in New Zealand, food rescue would probably still be useful for kind of temporary food distribution during disasters and disruptions. So what emerged during our recent interviews was discussion about how food rescue infrastructure could provide a useful kind of just-in-case network to potentially store emergency food supplies and other supplies. And as these food supplies reach their end-of-use state, they could be redistributed or replaced through the food rescue networks, and that the hard and soft infrastructure already exists here for food rescue, right? So why not use and invest in it further to future-proof New Zealand's food security? We've also observed kind of these shifts in food rescue groups over the last 7 years. So they're increasingly moving beyond just food rescue and either leading or partnering with others to do to focus more on kind of food production, access and use. So for example, upcycling food and associated social enterprises, using rescued food in cooking classes and community kitchens, working with community gardens, urban farms and other local food and organic waste initiatives. So our sense is that food rescue groups will continue to expand into these areas and extend beyond that kind of temporary band-aid type approaches to food distribution. So that's it for me. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Graydon. It was really interesting, even and just sort of reflecting on your talk and the nature of that sort of acute emergency response, and then how as well that acute response is shaped as well by the sort of the longer term conditions that Jess and Trish talked about in particular. So we've had a number of questions come through, and I thought maybe just to sort of begin with kind of reflecting on again a bit about the sort of the long-term change that's necessary. And Graydon, you talked about sort of working towards a paradigm shift or revolutionary change. Others sort of mentioned the ways in which we have an economy that's set up largely for export at the expense of some other priorities such as domestic food security. And so, Jess, this first question is maybe to begin with you, if you are able to sort of are willing to comment. The sort of exporting kai is very important to the economy, but policy and legislation in some cases can prevent or delay hapu from meeting their own needs. We saw this not only following emergencies, such as in Kaikōura, there was a tapu on food collection, but as well, someone pointed out in South Canterbury, it took 10 years for hapu to get a matatai. And so where do we need to change, and how do we need to change so that domestic food security is reprioritized or prioritized in a different way? And where do we begin?
Kia ora. Thank you very much for the pārtai, great pārtai. We need to, I believe what we need to do is we need to come back and have a really honest relationship with our history in Aotearoa and about the role of agricultural colonisation in Aotearoa as the foundation on which our commodities and our export market and our GDP is manifested from. And so our GDP is actually built off the backs of stolen land from Indigenous peoples. And so let's have an honest conversation about that. Let's, you have to do that work individually, and it's hard work because we, are all interwound. I mean, that's the radical interdependency that exists within the treaty. Māori, we know ourselves in relationship to Pākehā under the treaty context, and Pākehā know themselves in relationship and as manuhiri within a treaty context. So let's come back and understand our history. There's a reason why when we drive around the motu that we look at bare paddocks and pasture. It's part of our colonisation. It was a deliberate process to destroy you destroy food sources and medicines from Indigenous communities. And this is not just unique to New Zealand, but all around the world. Then you start to erode the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples and you start to erase us. And then, colonisation, the colonisation and the civilising mission that sits behind colonisation can become enacted. So let's start there. Let's have an honest look at that. When we talk about, yes, we produce enough food to feed 50 million people, actually let's reframe that. Let's reframe that in coming to know our history in Aotearoa. When we keep saying go commodity markets, more GDP, more dairy farming, more exporting, actually we just continue to perpetuate everyday settler colonialism. So that's where I'd say we need to start individually and then bring it into the workspaces and the food spaces that we're working in.
Thanks for that. Trish, did you want to comment on that as well?
No, I think Jess said it beautifully, so I'll just leave it with Jess.
Because I guess that one of the things that I kind of picks up on some of what Joe talked about was this sort of idea. It's come up in other sort of contexts, but this idea of kind of erosive coping, that we sort of undermine the very foundations, whether those are life support systems, biophysical, cultural, social, economic, and that disasters basically reveal the limitations and the extent to which we've undermined those systems. And so, Joe, I was wondering if you would sort of maybe just comment and reflect, particularly on some of the work in Kaikōura, but also some of that kind of the way in which that kind of acute disaster risk and the role of food recovery in that kind of acute phase, and how that links to that longer term perspective.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think what Jess was saying as well, absolutely critical. I think we've just lost sight of why we're producing food and who we're producing it for sometimes. And sometimes the systems are not necessarily in place to make it easy to access the food that we are producing as well. So one of the issues in Kaikōura in particular, and again, we see this in lots of parts of regional New Zealand. You know, the milk factory had recently closed, so that so the milk was being hundreds of thousands of litres of milk was being dumped because the roads were closed, so the milk couldn't get out. And also issues around, I understand compliance is really, really important, but, you know, everyone was living on sausages, frozen sausages. No one could access the meat that was right there. Because, yeah, so on the other hand, we did see the community stepping forward, particularly the local marae in Kaikōura, and we've seen this time and time again how important marae are for the response, particularly that response phase of disasters. I know it was the same in the cyclone up north. Making sure that all marae have generators and the resources they need to be able to respond. So, yeah, I think in the immediate response period after a disaster, the issue is the systems we've got in place that don't necessarily facilitate access to the food that's there, and also ensuring that those communities, the community hubs, whether that be marae or for many urban Pacific communities, the church is absolutely central. We see that with sort of vaccination drives, but yeah, that's probably just making sure those community hubs are really prepared or have the resources they need in the immediate response stage.
You're on mute, Nick.
So
thanks for that. Thinking about some of the recommendations that came out of the sort of the synthesis of research, and the need to sort of really sort of advance kind of diversity, not only diversity in terms of our food systems, but also diversity in terms of those response mechanisms and those enabling responses, such as you talked about food rescue and the role of food rescue in recovery. So I was just wondering if you just had any additional reflections, just mainly on the significance of diversity as part of that enabling, broader enabling context for food security.
Is that aimed at Graydon? You were muted when you started the question.
Yeah, aimed at Graydon, sorry.
Cool, thanks, Nick. Probably, so work colleagues and I did in kind of the COVID response and that kind of stuff, did really highlight the importance of diversity for production and access, right? So we saw the channeling of food through supermarkets, right? And that had a whole bunch of negative impacts for people, from price through to, social heaps of things. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just such a big supporter of diversity in general, right? And there's so many great examples of ways to do that. And actually, I kind of think maybe Trish, I'll throw this to you, given the work Sonia Cameron did analysing local food strategies across the country. It might be just a chance to kind of plug that work, because I think it really highlights the diversity of stuff that's already happening around the country and that we can build on for some of these social changes that are needed. Is that all right, Trish?
I was going to say, yep. Then I'd have to really understand what the question was in the first place, because I got a bit lost in the asking. Sorry.
Essentially, I mean, yeah, like how can diversity play not only a role in as Graydon said, in the supply of food, but also in the response. So typically the response has fallen, responses typically to large-scale disasters are very centralized. And so how can that distributed response be better enabled? What's the role of it? And how can it be supported, particularly in advance of a disaster? Because when there is a disaster, it's too late if those things aren't already in place.
So separate to Sonia's research, some of the other work that we've done, like in the pandemic and the rest of it, we would say the key to all of that is actually listening. What happened in pandemic was that everybody was in the same space, so communities did community and listened to each other, and then government did a lot of listening to communities, and particularly when the pandemic first happened in that first lockdown. We knew that civil defence wasn't the answer, and so for those that were trying to distribute food, MSD picked up that piece of it, and it actually created a really good communication chain. So I mean, my advice is communicate, and part of communicating is actually listening. When in any of those settings we listen well to what's actually happening and what is actually needed, then we do really well, and that often we're going to need lots of different ways that that's going to happen. I remember with Cyclone Gabrielle, because we'd made the connections really well previously, we had an organisation that couldn't phone out, but somehow used their Wi-Fi to link to my messenger, which was really bizarre. And I then linked to NZFN, the New Zealand Food Network, in order to get the order on the truck that meant the truck got in. It was a really bizarre way of communicating, but it was about using the tools that we had. And I think that when you're talking about preparing so that when things happen, you're ready, it's about already communicating and honouring how everybody is at the table and where the voices are. And one of the things that we constantly are saying in rooms is, who is not at your table? Who is not at your table? If you're trying to build a thing, who is not at your table that should be at your table? Why are iwi and hapu not at the table? Why is it when Pacifica experience food insecurity in disproportionate numbers to any of the rest of our population, why are they never at the table when we talk about food security or food insecurity? Hello, they're not at this table today. Just really want to honour that. So yeah, communicate, but remember who you need to be communicating with. Yeah.
Thanks very much. We've just got a couple minutes left, but I just wanted maybe, and I'll leave this to any of you that do want to sort of volunteer and answer. With the end of the National Science Challenges and with the end of the sort of the 10-year sort of mission-led investment, there was a question about how to of any other kura that are set up around the country that might be focused on science, environment, and climate change. And in the absence of these challenges, which have provided a role and a space to link some of these activities up, what's the one thing that you might see as an opportunity to link up different activities to really build this capability and capacity and to foster these sorts of conversations going forward? Anyone have any suggestions?
I'm happy to make a comment there. I think for Māori communities, for Kairangahau Māori, let's keep uplifting and connecting with the existing Māori research networks that already exist. Ngā pai o te māramatanga. Trish mihi atu ki a koe, I love your whakaro. Who's not in the room? Who's not at the table? We're our whanaunga from the Pacific. Keep identifying who needs to be at the table. How can we take capitalist patriarchy out of this conversation or out of the decision-making roles in these conversations and put other people, put women, put rangatahi, put other people into these conversations? These networks existed anyway. The National Science Challenges, wonderful work, especially in the Māori space, has just brought them all to the fore. But we're not starting from scratch. We're not losing a whole lot of things. We have to remember, definitely as Indigenous peoples, we have these networks. We had them before, and we'll just go back to the way that we were working. So mihi anō kia koutou katoa.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jess. Thank you again to all four of our presenters. It's been really tremendous, and I'll pass back to Hotapu to wind us up.
Wow, o tēnā rā tātou katoa. Tuatahi ake, ka rere tonu ngā mihi kia koutou ngā kai kōrero. Nā koutou te kākano i whakatō i roto i a tātou. Kia whakaniko e te kupu, kia whakanako i te kōrero hoki. Maha rawa, te atāhua te hohonu o ngā kōrero, ko te manako, ko tākuna mai wetahi o ngā taonga ke roto i o kōrero. Kia whakaora ai tātou anō, ki roto i a tātou anō. So yeah, massive thank you to our presenters for all of the kōrero, the wisdom, the knowledge, the insights that you guys have shared, and also for being champions in this space as well. And similar to the final point there, trying to bring everybody involved in the conversation, not just kind of the usual go-to norms. So big mihi to you guys, but also to those of you that stayed till the end. I know life is busy, life is hectic for everybody, but thank you all for persevering, and no doubt that there would have been some beautiful kōrero that you were able to take away, to consider, to reflect on, and perhaps even put into action. Just a reminder, this is being recorded, and we will be sending out a recording of to everyone that registered for this webinar, and any questions that we didn't get to, and I know that there was a lot, and it was great to see the discussion flowing in the chat, but any questions that we didn't get to, we'll endeavour to get those responses to you either directly, or if they were kind of general questions aimed at everybody or anybody, then we'll make sure that those answers are included in the send out along with the recording. But just a whakatauki that came to mind in closing before I finish up our hui, is this one. Mā te whakarongo ka mōhio, mā te mōhio ka mārama, mā te mārama ka mātou, mā te mātou ka ora. So through listening comes knowledge, through knowledge comes understanding, through understanding comes wisdom, through wisdom comes well-being. Ko tērā tātou e hoama. Nō reira, ka whakairihia te tapu, kia wātea te ara ke mui a tātou, kia pai ai tō tātou mahi, anō hoki ngā huatanga o te rā ke mui a tātou, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Kia pai te rā e homa.